So back in 2015, Europe's biggest defense problem was, basically figuring out how to spend less money without completely annoying all its allies.
Right.
But today, I mean, they are legally binding themselves to spend, what, $2.7 trillion that they literally do not have.
Yeah. And to buy weapons made from critical minerals they don't even own yet.
Exactly. It's wild. And if you look at the headlines right now, like here in May 2026, it really feels like someone just took the global map, set it on fire, and threw it in a blender.
It really does.
I mean, we've got wars, these massive energy spikes,
Yeah.
huge domestic political shifts. It's genuinely chaotic. And frankly, trying to keep up with it can feel completely overwhelming for anyone.
Oh, it feels overwhelming because we naturally try to view these things, in isolation. Like this is a distinct event, that's a distinct event.
Right.
But they aren't isolated at all. There's this hidden architecture connecting all of them.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive. We want to hand you, the listener, a master key to understand why all this chaos is happening simultaneously right now,
Hmm.
and more importantly, how major global players, specifically looking at Europe and Canada, are just radically rewriting their survival strategies right before our eyes.
Yeah, and we're getting all of this from a really fascinating source.
We are. We're pulling from a brand new paper that actually just dropped yesterday, May 5th, 2026, by the Global Review. It's authored by Dr. Novin and Associates, and it's basically this game theoretic analysis of how these nations are navigating what the authors call a polycrisis.
It's a phenomenal piece of research. But before we really get into the mechanics of their analysis, we should probably set some ground rules for our discussion today.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Because the source material analyzes some very recent, highly charged geopolitical events. It covers the ongoing war in Iran, military actions by the U.S. and Israel, and some of those really intense populist political movements sweeping across Western democracies.
Right. And we want to make it, like, crystal clear to you listening, we are not taking any political sides here.
Absolutely not.
We're not endorsing the political viewpoints or the specific actions described in the source material. Our only goal today is to just impartially unpack the analytical framework, and the factual data that Dr. Novin's team is
Yeah,
presenting.
exactly. We are strictly looking at the strategic logic,
Uh.
the math and the game theory that's driving these massive global decisions.
Okay, so with that out of the way, let's unpack this. Because the foundation of that logic starts with this idea of the polycrisis,
Yeah.
right? Which, I'll be honest, sounds a bit like academic jargon.
It does sound like jargon, yeah. But they're using it to describe a very specific mechanical failure in the global system.
Okay.
So think about how the world used to operate. An energy shortage. That was handled by the energy ministers.
Right, it stayed in its lane.
Yeah. Exactly. A military conflict was handled by defense departments.
Yeah.
Supply chain hiccups, those were corporate problems. They were all independent variables. But a polycrisis means these systems are now so tightly coupled together that they function as a single, highly sensitive web.
Wow.
So a shock in global shipping instantly becomes a domestic inflation crisis, which then triggers a political crisis, which threatens military funding. You literally cannot separate them anymore.
Okay, so everything is just one giant domino effect now.
Basically, yes.
And to map out how countries actually survive a web like that, the paper uses something called Bayesian game theory, which sounds incredibly intimidating.
This sounds terrifying.
Right. But the core concept is actually super intuitive once you break it down. It's all about placing bets based on what you think someone else is going to do and then updating those bets when you get new information.
Yeah, and that updating process is the beating heart of international relations right now. So in Bayesian terms, you start with a prior belief, which is just your baseline assumption about how the world works.
Right.
And from the end of the Cold War until roughly, say, 2015, the absolute prior belief across the Western world was that the United States was an unconditional security guarantor.
Like, it was just a given.
It was treated as a law of physics. If a major threat emerged, the U.S. umbrella would open. No questions asked.
But then, the data started changing. We started getting these new signals, shifting political rhetoric, new tariffs, strategic disengagement from certain regions.
Right, and Bayesian logic dictates that when the signals change, you must update your prior belief into what's called a posterior belief.
Okay.
And that updated belief across European and Canadian leadership today is that the U.S. commitment is no longer absolute. It is now probabilistic.
Yeah.
It's, highly conditional.
It's like finding out the ironclad insurance policy on your house might actually just be a lottery ticket.
That is a perfect way to put it.
Like, suddenly you realize you can't just rely on dialing emergency services if something goes wrong. You need to start buying your own fire extinguishers immediately.
Yes. And what's fascinating here is that this specific calculated realization is the actual engine driving Europe and Canada into this unprecedented partnership. They
Interesting.
didn't just decide to merge their defense and industrial strategies out of nowhere. They both independently updated their Bayesian priors.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, two actors looked at the exact same global board, realized the old safety net had giant holes in it, and immediately started looking for new partners to help weave a replacement.
And I guess nothing forces you to test a new safety net, quite like a massive sudden shock to the system, which is exactly what we saw happen just a few months ago.
Oh, absolutely.
Because when you're operating in this new probabilistic world, a single event can expose every vulnerability you have in like an afternoon. I mean, the paper points directly to late February 2026.
Right, the Hormuz shock.
Exactly. When the U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iranian territory effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz.
And we have to talk about the sheer physical volume of what moves through that strait. It makes it the world's most critical economic artery. We are talking about a bottleneck that handles 25% of the world's seaborne oil trade
That is insane.
and nearly 20% of global liquefied natural gas, or LNG. So when that passage closed, game theorists call it a costly signal. It forces an immediate reaction from every single player on the board.
Because you can't just ignore it.
Exactly. Oil skyrocketed to roughly $130 a barrel almost instantly.
And Europe was caught completely exposed by this. The paper notes their natural gas storage was sitting at barely 30% capacity following a really harsh winter.
Mm-hmm.
So gas prices on the Dutch TTF, which if you don't know is basically the benchmark pricing hub for European natural gas, they just exploded. They doubled to over 60 euros per megawatt hour.
Yeah, the economic damage has been immediate and just severe.
I mean, Euro area GDP growth for 2026 had to be revised down to around 1%, and UK inflation is projected to break 5% again.
And the paper also highlights a terrifying secondary shock here that most people completely miss. 30% of global urea and sulfur exports transit through Hormuz.
Wait, really?
Yes.
Which are the absolute bedrock ingredients for agricultural fertilizer. So if I'm tracking this polycrisis correctly, a military strike in the Middle East chokes off natural gas, which spikes European energy costs.
Right.
But it also chokes off fertilizer, which pretty much guarantees a massive global food price crisis in the developing world just a few months later.
That is the polycrisis in action. Everything is connected.
But wait, I want to push back on the European energy vulnerability for a second, because I think a lot of people listening might be a little confused by this.
Sure.
If Europe's energy grid is, over 50% powered by renewables right now, why are they still so catastrophically vulnerable to a fossil fuel shock in the Middle East? I mean, shouldn't all those wind turbines and solar panels act as a shield?
You would think so, right? But the global energy market doesn't really work like that. Think of the global LNG market like a massive, high-stakes game of musical chairs.
Okay.
When the Strait of Hormuz closes, 20% of the chairs are suddenly yanked away. Europe, even with its really impressive renewable grid, still needs natural gas for baseline power when the wind isn't blowing and for, heavy industrial manufacturing.
Right. They still need a chair to keep their economy from collapsing.
They absolutely do. So Europe takes out its checkbook and heads to the spot market, where they have to bid against massive Asian economies for the few remaining chairs. The wind turbines just mean Europe is bidding for slightly fewer chairs than they used to.
Oh, I see.
But because that marginal unit of gas is required to keep the lights on, they get dragged into a global bidding war that drives the price of everything through the roof. So renewables blunt the impact, yeah, but they do not isolate you from the global market panic.
The panic just gets priced in everywhere. But the paper argues that this specific crisis in Hormuz has really changed the geopolitical calculus, right? Because previous energy spikes were mostly framed as, environmental catalysts.
Yeah, the Hormuz shock fundamentally altered the definition of energy policy. It is no longer viewed through the lens of carbon reduction. It's viewed strictly through the lens of national sovereignty.
Wow.
The political will for total electrification and this massive revival of nuclear power is cementing right now because leaders realize that if you do not control the physical molecules powering your grid, you do not control your own foreign policy.
which sets off the next massive domino in the paper. Because if energy autonomy is the first pillar of sovereignty, military capability has to be the second. If you can't rely on an unconditional American security guarantee anymore, and you need to protect your own energy infrastructure, you have to build your own military. You have to literally pay for your own sovereignty.
And the physical cost of that sovereignty is just staggering. The paper anchors this massive shift to the June 2025 NATO summit in The Hague.
Right.
That summit resulted in a binding legal commitment by all members to reach 5% of their GDP in defense spending by 2035.
5%.
Yeah. The breakdown is 3.5% for core military hardware and personnel, and then 1.5% for broader security things like cyber defense, critical infrastructure protection.
And here's where it gets really interesting to me. The math required to hit 5% is almost incomprehensible.
It's hard to wrap your head around.
The paper estimates a collective $2.7 trillion increase across the alliance. Italy has to increase its defense budget by 211%.
Yeah.
Spain looked at their economy and literally had to request a formal exemption because the math would just bankrupt them.
Yep.
Germany had to amend its constitutional debt brake, which is like a fundamental law of their modern economy, just to allow the government to borrow the money to buy the weapons.
It's a total paradigm shift.
But, I mean, a 5% GDP target for defense is historically unprecedented outside of an active total war scenario. How on earth do democratically elected governments sell a 200% defense budget increase to voters who are already struggling with, 5% inflation and skyrocketing energy and food bills?
Well, this raises an important question, and it's the exact trap Dr. Novin's team identifies as Europe's trilemma.
The trilemma.
Right. These governments are trying to balance three mutually exclusive priorities right now. First, strategic autonomy, spending the billions needed to build up their military and industrial base.
Okay.
Second, economic openness, keeping international trade flowing so their economies don't just stall out. And third, political cohesion.
Meaning keeping the public happy, managing the migration pressures that come from those global food shocks we talked about, and basically stopping the political system from fracturing.
Exactly. And the fiscal strain of this rearmament risks completely shattering that third pillar. Just think about the mechanics of it. A government only has a finite budget. If they need to spend hundreds of billions on fighter jets and secure energy grids, they either have to heavily tax an already exhausted public, or they have to gut their social safety nets, pensions, healthcare, education.
And if you gut the social safety net during an inflation crisis, you practically guarantee a populist uprising at the next election.
You really do.
You'll get politicians running on a platform of just scrapping the defense budget entirely to lower taxes. It's a total crisis of democratic legitimacy.
Which is exactly why the Canadian pivot, highlighted in the paper, is arguably the most significant geopolitical shift of the decade.
Oh, yeah. Let's talk about Canada.
Because Canada was historically the most deeply integrated, dependent player under the American security umbrella. But in February 2026, Prime Minister Mark Carney launched Canada's inaugural defense industrial strategy.
And the scale of this thing is massive.
It's a $500 billion blueprint. It's designed to achieve a 240% increase in defense revenues and create 125,000 new manufacturing jobs over 10 years.
The architecture of that strategy is what really caught my eye. They call it the Build, Partner, Buy framework.
Right.
And they are explicitly prioritizing domestic Canadian firms, completely reversing decades of reliance on buying American military tech. But they aren't just building like a walled garden in North America.
No, they're being very strategic.
Because Canada managed to become the only non-European nation granted access to the EU's €150 billion SAFE program. They are positioning themselves as the industrial bridge between North America and Europe.
Exactly. They are attempting to solve Europe's trilemma by offering this integrated industrial base. But here's the catch. To build that base, to manufacture the tanks, the advanced radar systems, the next generation batteries for the energy grid, you need raw materials.
So basically, Europe and Canada pass these massive budgets, they create these historic alliances, and they set out to build this massive independent defense system. But then they look at the blueprints and realize the batteries aren't included.
That's exactly it.
And even worse, their biggest strategic rival owns the only battery factory on Earth.
Yeah, the paper makes it brutally clear. The era of supply chains being optimized purely for cheap, just-in-time delivery, that's dead.
Over.
Supply chains are now geopolitical weapons, and China holds near absolute dominance over the board right now. China controls roughly 60% of the global production for critical minerals, But more importantly, they control 90% of the refining capacity.
And that distinction is huge, right? Because getting the rock out of the ground is only step one.
Right.
Turning that rock into like a high purity rare earth magnet that actually goes into the guidance system of a missile or the turbine of a wind farm, that requires highly specialized refining.
It does.
And the paper states that the European Union relies on China for an astonishing 98% of its rare earth magnets. 98%.
It is a staggering single point of failure. I mean, you cannot build a strategically autonomous military if 98% of your core components require the permission of a geopolitical rival.
You just can't.
And China demonstrated their willingness to use this leverage when they deployed those coercive export controls back in 2025.
Which brings us right back to why Canada is the linchpin in this entire global realignment. Because Canada holds the ultimate geographic trump card here. The paper points out that Canada possesses 10 of the 12 critical minerals deemed essential by NATO, right alongside the world's largest high-grade uranium deposits.
The strategic alignment is obvious, but executing it actually requires abandoning decades of economic orthodoxy.
How so?
Well, the Western response is shifting rapidly from free market economics to state-directed industrial policy. We are seeing coordinated price guarantees designed to artificially support non-Chinese suppliers.
Oh, to protect them from being undercut by state-subsidized Chinese minerals.
Exactly. And Canada is leading the new Critical Minerals Production Alliance to physically integrate their resource extraction directly with Europe's manufacturing hubs.
It's just a massive high-stakes coordination game. I mean, if Europe and Canada successfully link Canada's mineral wealth with Europe's industrial capacity, they achieve that elusive strategic resilience. They can actually build the weapons and the grids they budgeted for.
Right.
But if they fail, if bureaucratic friction slows them down, they remain totally paralyzed by Chinese export controls. And the paper notes this looming deadline, November 2026, when current Chinese export suspensions are set to expire. That's a massive decision node coming up.
It's the moment of truth.
Yeah.
Because if the EU-Canada alternative supply chain isn't credible by that November deadline, Beijing could permanently weaponize those controls, effectively suffocating both the Western green energy transition and their military rearmament in one move.
Wow. Okay, so taking all of this into account, we have probabilistic alliances, we've got energy shocks cascading to food crises, a $2.7 trillion defense scramble, the trilemma threatening domestic politics, and a ticking clock on critical minerals.
It's a lot.
So what does this all mean? How does Dr. Novin's team actually predict the next 10 years will play out?
Well, true to their game theoretic framework, they don't offer like a single crystal ball prediction. Instead, they calculate Bayesian probabilities for 3 distinct equilibrium scenarios for the decade spanning 2026 to 2036.
Okay, let's look at where they are placing their chips. The scenario with the highest current probability sitting at 55% is what they call fragmented adaptation.
Right, and this is essentially the path of highest resistance. In this scenario, leaders attempt to adapt, but domestic politics constantly derail international coordination.
So the trilemma wins.
Exactly. European nations face massive voter backlash and quietly miss those 5% NATO targets. Euro area growth remains stagnant, trapped around 1% annually.
Wow.
The critical mineral alliances get bogged down in trade disputes, leaving energy volatility as a permanent structural drag on the Western economy. It's basically a world where the old safety net is gone, but the new one is too full of holes to catch anyone.
Oof. Then there's the optimistic gamble, scenario B, strategic convergence. Dr. Novin's team currently gives this a 20% probability, but they forecast it could rise to 38% by 2036 if these early integration efforts actually hold.
Yeah, this is the scenario where the coordination game succeeds. The EU and Canada achieve deep, frictionless structural integration. They bypass the Chinese bottlenecks, achieving 55% independence in mineral refining. This allows them to build robust, autonomous green energy grids that immunize them from Middle Eastern energy shocks.
That would be huge.
And ultimately, they field a fully operational, financially sustainable European-Canadian defense bloc. They basically solve the polycrisis through unity.
Okay, and finally we have scenario C, systemic fragmentation, the absolute worst-case scenario. And the paper assigns this a stubborn 22 to 25% probability.
This is the cascading failure model.
Right.
Persistent economic recessions driven by high energy and food costs trigger intense political crises. We see the populist capture of major European governments. The alliances don't just stall, they actively fracture.
Oh, man.
Instead of pooling resources, Western allies turn on each other, engaging in cutthroat, competitive bidding wars for scarce minerals and LNG. The foundational architecture of the West essentially collapses into isolationism.
We are literally watching the global operating system recompute. But, if you're listening to this on your commute or at the gym, why should you care which of these three macroeconomic scenarios actually wins out?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, these probabilities dictate your daily reality. This isn't just abstract theory discussed in situation rooms.
Right.
The outcome of this coordination game determines the price of your groceries. It determines the stability of your local job market, the inflation rate on your mortgage.
Yeah.
It dictates whether you will live in a decade of localized political stability or one defined by rolling, unpredictable crises in everything from, the supply chain of your electronics to the cost of heating your home.
It is a literal race to build a new system before the weight of the polycrisis crushes the old one. So, to quickly summarize our deep dive into Dr. Novin's analysis today, Europe and Canada are radically recalculating their entire future because the foundational assumption of the last 70 years, the absolute certainty of the U.S. security umbrella, is gone.
It's gone.
We are living in a deeply connected polycrisis, where an energy shark in Hormuz dictates defense panic in Berlin and mining policy in Ottawa. But, as the paper points out, it's also an era of unprecedented historic strategic adaptation.
And that adaptation requires a fundamental rewiring of how nations measure risk and sovereignty. They are learning to navigate a world without guarantees.
Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with today. The source beautifully frames this international shift as moving from a world of guaranteed contracts to a world of probabilistic bets. The ultimate insurance policy has been canceled. Everyone is just playing the odds based on the best data they have. And I want you to think about your own life, your own career, or your business for a second.
It's a great question to ask.
If you look at the systems you rely on right now, your personal supply chains, your investments, your career trajectory, the daily necessities you take for granted, how many of those are built on a hidden assumption of absolute stability? In a rapidly shifting world where absolute guarantees no longer exist, how probabilistic are your safety nets? Are you still holding a lottery ticket, or have you started buying your own fire extinguishers?
That really is the defining question for the era we are entering.
It really is. Thank you so much for taking this journey with us today, for engaging with these complex frameworks, and for letting us share this deep dive with you. Keep questioning the world around you, keep looking for those hidden connections, and we will catch you next time.